Is Brazil going bust? As the economic crisis bites, we ask where it all went wrong for Latin America's biggest economy. Also on today's program, too poor to flee, the daily realities for the forgotten victims of Syria's war. And in Picture This, another deadly attack on education in Pakistan. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. Carnival season is approaching in Brazil, but there's little to celebrate. After a woeful 2015, the country's economy is in a bad way, and it doesn't look like 2016 will bring any respite. The IMF says the economy, the biggest in Latin America, could shrink at least 3% this year. Last year, investment in Brazil plummeted, unemployment skyrocketed, and inflation spiraled, all contributing to the longest downturn the country has seen since the 1930s. With the Rio Olympics around the corner, Brazil now faces some tough decisions to get the economy back on track. But today's newsmaker, Brazilian President Dilma Roussef, faces a bribery scandal in her government, a currency that's lost 35% of its value, and sliding popularity ratings. And many blame her government for Brazil's bust.
It's one of the world's biggest celebrations. Around 5 million people moved to the samba beat for 4 days straight. But this year, there's a headache before the parties even started. With less than 2 weeks to go until Carnival, Brazil's famous samba spirit may be somewhat subdued. The economy is suffering from the worst recession since the 1930s, and with the public purse tightening, parades are being scaled back across the country. Adding to the woes, footing the bill for the 2014 World Cup and this year's Olympic Games. The combined cost of hosting those events is more than $30 billion. A painful burden now that the boom times are over. Rewind to 2009 when Rio de Janeiro was awarded the Olympics. Brazil was buoyant, a member of the BRIC group of leading emerging markets. The economy was soaring thanks to government stimulus and strong demand for commodities. But the mood has since shifted from optimism to disappointment. Global growth has faltered while commodity prices have tumbled. The economy of the South American powerhouse contracted nearly 4% in 2015 and is forecast to shrink by a further 3% this year.
Politicians here are struggling with the budget deficit, tax dodgers, inflation, and fleeing foreign investors. Voters are taking out their frustration on President Dilma Roussef, who's been linked to a series of corruption scandals.
I think the government is very lost and is lacking the capacity to react because they still haven't understood what happened. They are lacking political support, they are lacking support within the Congress, and they are simply trying to survive.
Dilma Roussef holds the title of being Brazil's least popular leader in history. Last year, more than 1 million people protested against her government and its austerity measures. And a few days ago, police fought with demonstrators at a march against transport fare hikes. Tensions seem likely to rise as Olympic organizers race to get Rio ready for the Games without blowing any more cash. There's little doubt Brazilians will make August's opening ceremony a colorful spectacle. But with moods and incomes sinking, their hearts might just not be in it. Annelise Borges, The Newsmakers, Rio de Janeiro.
Well, joining me now to discuss Brazil's economic woes in Washington is Kelly Myman-Hawk, who's a managing partner at McClarty Associates. And in Paris is Philippe Montero, who's a professor of strategy at INSEAD Business School. Thanks both of you for joining us. Philippe Montero, let's start with you. Give me the one main reason Brazil's economy is in so much trouble.
Hello, good afternoon. I think it's hard to spell out one main reason. I think it is a combination of external factors with deep political gridlock. So I wouldn't single out one main reason, but I would say the combination is very serious. So we're seeing some kind of perfect storm for Brazil now.
And with that in mind, is it President Dilma Roussef's fault for not dealing with it properly, Philippe?
I do believe it is. I think she's not the sole responsible for it, but she was, right, President of Brazil for her previous term. There were things that had to be done that were not done. And also, I think the way she was elected, right, the promise that she made to be elected were promises that she could not kind of keep. So since the beginning of this year, we have seen she trying to do things that were exactly against what she said she would do.
Kelly Myman-Hawk, she made promises she couldn't keep. Was that at the heart of it all?
Well, I think it goes further back. Every politician that presides over a boom likes to say that that boom was due to his or her efforts, right? And every politician that presides over a bust likes to say that it was the previous guy's fault. But I do think that in this case, if you look at the boom years under President Lula after the global financial crisis, how did they manage that so well? I mean, in great measure, they threw a lot of money at it. They hypercapitalized the development banks. They invested in infrastructure. They invested in building the middle class through conditional cash transfer programs. The real challenge, I would say, for President Roussef is that, she didn't pull the plug on the party, basically. All of those countercyclical spending policies can make sense in a global recessionary environment. But the bottom line is they can't last forever. So the inability of her to terminate those programs, phase them out during her first term, and yes, she continued to make the promises during the campaign, and none of those policies were going to be sustainable in the long term.
Philippe, to what extent did the Petrobras scandal hurt overall investor confidence in Brazil? And just sort of get us to the stage where people didn't really trust Brazil anymore?
I wouldn't go that far, right? So I think one of the things that we should know from this crisis is, as serious as it is, right, institutions are working pretty well. So I think if you see the role, right, of the federal police, if you see the role of the Supreme Court of Brazil, they are doing extremely well. So I wouldn't go as far as say, people will stop trusting Brazil, but I think we cannot underestimate, right, how pervasive is the corruption scandal, because Petrobras is such an important company for Brazil. There are so many suppliers, the supply chain is such an important supply chain for Brazil. So when you see a crisis in Petrobras, I think there are so many other effects.
Philippe, do you trust those institutions to deal with the high inflation, the fact that there's been almost 1 million job losses? We're looking at some of these examples now in the build-up to the Olympics. Grandstands are being reduced when they're building them for the Olympics. Cars and volunteers for the Olympics are being slashed. With all of this happening, do you trust those institutions to ride the storm?
So I would separate, right, the institutions in the sense of keeping a democratic process, keeping independence between the powers from the major political and economic issues the country is facing. So if you ask me, do I trust that the Olympics will go well and Brazil will manage to put it together? I do, right? So Brazil has seen many crises before. There were a lot of suspicions during the Soccer World Cup or what would happen, and everything went well. This said, I think the problems that we see now and this big turmoil that you're referring to, they won't go away. So as you were saying at the beginning of the program, I think the IMF had just changed the prediction for this year. It's kind of, they are predicting a recession of 3.5. So before they were thinking it was 1%. Now they kind of redefined to 3.5. Next year, according to their numbers, they're predicting kind of flat, kind of zero, right, growth. Before they were predicting 2.3. So on the one hand, if you, right, in the very short term, and you think about Brazil overall and the Olympics, I think Brazil will put it together. It's going to work. But the problems won't go away. Olympics will Carnival will finish, Olympics will finish, and the problem will be there.
Okay. Kelly, not too long ago, just about a year ago, you told a CFR panel, I have a lot of faith in Joachim Levy, the finance minister. He's incredibly competent, incredibly hard worker, incredibly driven, and incredibly needed right now. And what is making me optimistic is the fact that President Rousseff realizes that what Brazil needs right now is the difficult medicine that Joachim is doling out. And then she fired him. So do you think she blundered by replacing him?
Well, I think at that point she didn't have much of a choice. Joaquim is an incredibly talented economist, and all of those things I said on the CFR panel. The political situation in Brazil, I mean, you've got a country that has over 30 political parties and a very contentious Congress, and many of the measures that Brazil needs to take to put its fiscal house in order and kind of end that post-cyclical spending spree need to go through congressional approval. And that proved to be incredibly difficult. And, you know, even during his time as minister, I mean, you saw a number of downgrades happen, not because Joaquim was fired, but just because he was facing so many challenges in righting the policy ship.
Are the BRICS done? Should we chuck that away for good? And are people maybe asking deeper questions that, you know, are these ideas of emerging economies, are they just bubbles waiting to burst?
So I think it's a fair question, right? Is the BRICS label done? I think for many people, yes. If you expand that question to are the emerging markets just a bubble? I don't think so. So I think emergence, I think is a much more realistic, and when we teach our students here, that's what we try to convey, it's much more realistic to believe that emergence is a process with a lot of bumps, rather than believing that emergence means linear growth.
Okay, Kelly, final thoughts from you as to what other countries can learn from Brazil's crisis.
I would say that the other countries that might be analyzing Brazil could really take the lesson away that don't waste boom years. I think that if Brazil during the boom years would have pursued attacks on corruption more vigorously, would have pursued some of the structural reforms that the economy really needed to get on its solid footing, and also would have integrated itself more effectively into global supply chains and taken a less statist economic view and a more globalist point of view in the way that it grew during those years, I think that we would see Brazil in a much different situation today.
Kelly Myman-Hawk and Philippe Montero, thank you very much for your thoughts. Still to come on the Newsmakers, did the UN ignore Medaya's starvation crisis? We speak to one man who says it did. And in Picture This, another deadly attack on education in Pakistan. This month, the little herd of Syrian town of Medaya was thrust into the spotlight after it emerged that residents of the besieged town were dying of starvation. The town in Syria's northwest has been under siege by government forces and Hezbollah militants for 7 months, while the media spotlight has been on the hundreds of thousands of refugees fleeing Syria. For those left behind, the horrors of war are a daily reality. The Newsmakers' Ashraf Helmi has this report.
For Mira and Yasmina, life is slowly getting better. The two sisters fled Hama in Syria 2 years ago with their family. They come here to a coffee shop in Istanbul to read and make new friends. But they still think of home.
I remember being scared when the fighting first started. We thought it would be like the revolution in Egypt, but it was much worse. No one in my family thought it would turn out like this.
I'm very sad for children my age still stuck in Syria. I just wish one day they can feel safe and not suffer anymore.
And children are in the firing line. In towns and cities across Syria, barrel bombs are part of daily life. The complex nature of this war means families are at risk, not only from fighting between regime forces and rebel groups, but also from airstrikes from the US-led coalition and Daesh. This video, which has been viewed thousands of times on YouTube, shows a normal school classroom believed to be in Idlib. As the teacher addresses the students, a barrel bomb lands just meters away. Much of the debate around refugees has focused on their journey to Europe. But these numbers are just the tip of the iceberg. They represent a mere 6% of Syrians affected by the war. Another 4 million are living in neighboring countries such as Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. And then there's a third figure, which dwarfs even that. About 7.6 million are displaced inside Syria, and their struggle remains very much out of sight. The family of Aylan Kurdi, the Syrian boy who was found dead washed up on a beach in Turkey, spent years trapped inside Syria, unable to get out. They moved from Damascus to Aleppo and then later on to Kobane. And the millions of children still stuck inside Syria face a grim future. When these images of emaciated children came out of the besieged town of Madaya, it became another defining moment in the war. Children in Syria are also at risk from Daesh. In its stronghold Raqqa, many are being indoctrinated from a young age. For these two sisters, now safe in Istanbul, they have a new life. But they haven't forgotten the life they once had. Mira likes to sing about her country and the hope of one day going back home. Ashraf Helmi, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now is Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and co-editor of Crimes of War, What the Public Should Know, Roy Gutmann. Thanks a lot for joining us.
Thank you.
Roy, I read your foreign policy piece, very powerful. You ask the question, is the UN choosing diplomacy over the lives of innocent children? What do you think? You think that's the case?
First of all, to describe the situation in Syria, you have to emphasize, and actually that film did not, that there are a lot of people living under siege. And the actual numbers are in great dispute. The UN talks about 400,000, of whom 200,000 roughly are under government siege. But the actual number under government siege may be a lot higher. And Madaya is an example of a town under siege, in fact, one we really didn't know about. The UN did not publicize it. It wasn't on the list of besieged towns, even though there was no food there since, I guess, October. And the UN has the right, the authority by the Security Council, in fact, to send convoys there anytime it wants to. And they tried 10 times, apparently, in the course of last year. They only got one approval at the end of December, and that was the approval that went through in early January. But meanwhile, the UN was saying nothing about it. Right. So in a sense, yes, to come back to your question, they are doing diplomacy, but it's silent, it's hidden diplomacy, even as people are starving.
If I was working for the UN right now, I might tell you, but Roy, you know how this works. You need to cooperate to get in. Otherwise, you don't get to do anything. You don't get to do any work in the country. You have to speak to the government and kind of treat the whole thing with kid gloves, don't you?
Well, I have a different experience. Now, it goes back to the Balkans in the 1990s, which is where I got that prize. And the prize, it was actually for revealing what was going on in the country, which was done at great difficulty. The UN, it's the same United Nations that was involved there, trying to get food to the hungry in places that were more or less besieged or almost entirely cut off. And there the UN took a different stance. For one thing, there was a spokesman. There was somebody at the UN High Commission for Refugees or somewhere else in the UN system who publicly berated the people who were causing the siege. They went to the scene, of, say, Srebrenica, one of the towns that was besieged. You know, Srebrenica had about 25,000 population, but of course it was swollen a lot. The number of people under siege in Syria could be 1 million, and the UN doesn't say anything about them. So they didn't say anything about Madaya, and they don't say anything really about the sieges in general.
Is one of the reasons why it's so difficult for them the fact that some towns are not besieged by the government, they're besieged by ISIS and other militant groups, that Madaya is not the only town that's besieged. You have Fua, you have Kefraya, you have Deir Zur, which is besieged by ISIS. Does that not complicate the matter that they can't give sort of clear policy on this?
I think that the rhetoric that comes out of the UN, the reports that come out of the UN, on the whole, confuse the public, and maybe they're even intended to confuse the public. Look, the basic facts are that the principal force that is besieging human beings, holding them in, refusing to allow any food to go in, is the Syrian government. It is at least 5 or 6 times greater than anybody besieging pro-government populations or anybody. There's a very small siege that is being run by the Syrian opposition forces, by Islamists. And in a sense, and that is in Kafraya and Fua. And one of the reasons that that siege came about is that it's a counter siege. It was intended to draw attention to the siege of Zabadani and the siege of Madaya. So the UN doesn't put any of this in perspective. Right. They lump them all together. They assume that we're so stupid that we're not going to check out their facts, and their facts don't check out.
Within Madaya itself, there are reports and claims that the rebels are seizing food, charging exorbitant prices up to $250 for a bag of rice. And that's one of the reasons people are starving, is because the rebels themselves are taking this and keeping it for themselves and charging crazy money. Now, again, this is Russian state media reporting on this. They have a dog in this fight. But that doesn't mean this might not be true. Is there any evidence of this happening?
I agree with you. I think one should look at all those reports and check them out. And this one doesn't check out. The fact is the town is surrounded either by barbed wire or by mines. The besieging forces, which is Hezbollah and the Syrian government, have mounted snipers. They shoot at people who try to escape to get food. It's been cut off completely. They haven't allowed anything in up until 10 days ago. They haven't allowed any outside commercial source of food to come in. They haven't allowed any UN convoy. So I think the Russian media should be actually checking out the facts themselves rather than repeating essentially the government position.
Now, you wrote that very strong piece. There was also an open letter from 100 or so humanitarian workers to the UN, to OCHA. They said, you have allowed the UN to become a political tool of war. That was to the OCHA head, Stephen O'Brien. He responded on Twitter saying the UN is doing everything in our power, impartially, neutrally, independently, to reach people in besieged parts of Syria. Do you believe him? That maybe after all of this, they're finally going to take this seriously?
I would believe the UN is making a real all-out effort if they went public. They have no business hiding the facts. We journalists have a very hard time getting the facts. We're not there. We can't really go inside safely. And we don't have enough sources. The UN has the overview, but they keep everything secret. They don't answer questions. They don't put out reports. Stephen O'Brien himself doesn't issue a daily, we could use a daily bulletin from the UN about what's going on in all the different theaters of war. They have a pretty good idea. But try to get that from the UN. No, on sieges, they're actually compromised by their own procedures. Because they have their own hidden, secret method of compiling the numbers from sieges, which they won't share with us, by the way, we don't even know what the numbers are. And so I think O'Brien ought to examine his own public relations, his own public stance, and stop sending tweets out that are misleading.
Roy Gutmann, great pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Glad to be. Thanks.
In today's Picture This, at least 22 people have been killed and 60 others wounded at a university in northwestern Pakistan. Gunmen stormed the Bacha Khan University in Charsada and opened fire on students and staff. One faction of the Pakistani Taliban said they're responsible, while another faction has condemned the attacks as un-Islamic. Today's newsmaker has been Brazilian President Dilma Roussef. Recent months have seen a growing chorus of calls for her impeachment. In 2012, polls said she had an approval rating of 65%. Today, that has dropped to just 12%. And with the Petrobras scandal rumbling on, an Olympic countdown underway, and a rapidly shrinking economy, 2016 could see Brazil's economic woes bite even harder. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garta. As always, thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.